Good evening, everyone. My name is Bethany Iser. I'm president of the CURESZ Foundation. CURE stands for Comprehensive Understanding via Research and Education into Schizophrenia. And today we're very happy to welcome Dr. Chris Marett to join us tonight. He is an associate professor, director of forensic psychiatry, and director of the Forensic Psychiatry Training Program at the University of Cincinnati. Dr. Marett, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Bethany, and thank you for everyone for attending this evening. As I mentioned to Bethany before we got started, it's really a treat to be able to talk about what I do. I'm often encountered when meeting new people or at a dinner party, and people ask, what do you do? And it's very difficult to capture the essence of it in a soundbite. And I get an hour tonight. So please bring your questions and your curiosities, and hopefully my talk will answer that, but I'd like to answer any other questions you have about what it is a forensic psychiatrist does, and hopefully you'll learn a bit along the way. So what is forensic psychiatry? My mentor, Dr. Douglas Mossman, seen here in the bow tie, which was his trademark attire, I thought gave the best working definition. Oftentimes, young graduates will rattle off something about the intersection of psychiatry and the law. Dr. Mossman said it was the specialty of medicine that applies psychiatric knowledge and findings to trials and other legal matters that courts and attorneys need to resolve. I like this. I kind of think of a forensic psychiatrist as almost a translator, almost an interpreter to help the court answer their own issues. So sometimes psychiatrists who are not well trained will wade into this and try to make the decisions, but that's up to the court. But what we can do is help them better understand mental health matters and how that applies to how the laws are written. So I'd like to run through then what are some things that forensic psychiatry in and of itself is not. We often end up doing a lot of these things as a forensic psychiatrist, and sometimes our training makes us well suited to do so, but you don't necessarily need to have the extra training in forensic psychiatry, which I'll talk about later, to do these things. So oftentimes we do end up seeing people with severe mental illness because unfortunately they're overrepresented in criminal populations and incarcerated populations. We end up caring for patients in the state hospital systems where people are sent, which I'll get into in a bit. We end up getting the patients that come to our clinic that have some legal involvement or criminal record, but you don't need to have the extra background to take care of people who have that. Sometimes we are called to help when we have patients who are at high risk for violence, and how can we intervene? We don't do crime scene investigation, and we should never both be the expert witness, a forensic psychiatrist, and a treating doctor for our patient. I do see that, unfortunately, sometimes in both of my roles, and to me, it's a reflection that the people are not taking it seriously. So what does a forensic psychiatrist do on a day-to-day basis then? I get, again, trying to explain it at dinner parties. They say, oh, well, you're into profiling, like criminal profiling, or, do you look at DNA evidence, or you must spend all of your time in court. Actually, I don't. Most of the matters that I consult on settle before they get to the opportunity to testify. So I don't spend as much time as Atticus Finch in the picture, for example, in court, although occasionally that is part of it. There is some study in the academic literature about stereotypes of forensic psychiatrists. One of my colleagues in Cleveland, Dr. Susan Hatters-Friedman, and her group wrote a great paper on some of the movie stereotypes of forensic psychiatrists in fiction. And there's a gamut of Dr. Evils, people who are unethical and use deceit to achieve nefarious goals, to people who are professorial and just confusing and condescending when they address the court, to people kind of like Dr. House, who are the jack of all trades, but not realistically a psychiatrist. But there's lots of misconceptions about what we do. There's Hannibal Lecter. What I actually do on a day-to-day basis looks a bit like this, perhaps on busier days even like this. a lot of what forensic psychiatry is reviewing disparate sources of data and try to make sense of it. So medical records, when I'm doing criminal forensic cases, different criminal records and documents, trying to get collateral information from people who know the person well or who have observed the person's behavior, and trying to integrate that into an opinion about what impact their mental condition had on their behavior. From there, probably the best starting point to sort out what I do then is to think of the differences between criminal and civil law. Civil law usually involves a private dispute between a person or an organization. It has a plaintiff who alleges that the defendant failed to carry out some duty, and because of that, they have some sort of damage that they need to be compensated for. In a criminal case, a defendant's action is considered to be harmful to society as a whole. So it's the state versus, or the US government versus so-and-so. And it's not necessarily the victim's responsibility to bring a criminal case as it might be on a plaintiff in a civil matter. The next starting point for asking what is it you do is to think about the jurisdiction. A forensic psychiatrist can consult locally. Typically, it's countywide, so there's a criminal matter in Hamilton County, and from there, either the common pleas court, which deals with felony matters, or the municipal court, which deals with misdemeanor matters, less serious matters. You can look at the state and federal levels. There are forensic psychiatrists who do these sorts of evaluations for the military. With our program's proximity to Dayton, Ohio, we've had a couple of Air Force trainees who've gone on to do things like court-martial evaluations for the military. And sometimes there can be other sorts of issues at stake, disability hearings, for example, or insurance companies who need an answer to a question that they have. So with that, there can be a variety of people who consult with me. It can be either a criminal or civil defense, a criminal prosecution, a plaintiff. Courts sometimes want independent opinions about a matter. Sometimes if you work at a state-based facility, they hire people to do evaluations through the court. Sometimes you can consult to a company. For example, a colleague of mine who's a forensic psychologist often consulted with Procter & Gamble to do risk assessments. Government agencies sometimes employ forensic psychiatrists to do the same. So it can be a variety of sources. The important thing is that you should base your opinion on what you see to be the objective truth of the matter, and you really have to fight hard against a bias to form an opinion that is beneficial to the party that retained you. So a lot of what I do in my training at the university is to teach people about the sorts of biases that they might encounter in doing these evaluations and find ways to combat that. Unfortunately, there is a problem with perception among our profession. Dr. Mossman, who you saw in the bow tie, very formal guy, actually wrote this paper here, Hired Guns, Whores, and Prostitutes. And it was a search of the legal literature of how many times in legal articles people had referred to forensic psychiatrists as these terms. And it was over 100 different times. So that was I think that was published in 2000. So you can only imagine since then the current that we've tried to fight against. The book on the right is a title that he actually left me on his bookshelf after he died. But again, goes to show that there is an issue with perception and credibility among forensic psychiatrists who serve as expert witnesses. So again, that stresses the importance of being objective, fighting against your biases, and working to show to a jury, this is how I came to my opinion. There might be an expert that disagrees with me in this matter, and most of the time I don't think that it's malevolent, but here is why I came to my opinion, and I won't hide anything from you about why I came to it. A lot of criminal forensic psychiatry, and to some extent civil forensic psychiatry, deals with this C word, competency. And it's a term that can apply to many specific functions. Often it gets end up used interchangeably with capacity, but it is typically something that is decided by a court. Forensic psychiatrists help the courts determine someone's competency about a particular issue, but it's a legal decision at the end of the day. That said, we can often help illuminate the matter and think about how these things might be impaired. Generally, it's thought within the law to be competent, someone has to make a knowing, intelligent, and voluntary decision. Oftentimes, forensic psychiatrists don't necessarily look at that third prong, voluntariness. We don't always get consulted to show that there is coercion, for example, but it's something you have to consider as well. We focus mainly on the first two. Was a decision knowing? Did the person have and process all of the available information? And did they do that in an intelligent manner? Not necessarily that they made what we thought was a great decision or a sound one, but did they do so rationally and intelligently? The most common competency in criminal forensic psychiatry is competency to stand trial. Does the person in present time have the ability to work with his attorney, his or her attorney, with a reasonable degree of rational understanding? And do they have a factual and rational understanding of the proceedings against him? These might be worded differently depending on which state or jurisdiction you're in, but it's basically those two prongs. Can you work with an attorney to defend yourself? And do you have some understanding of why you're there? As you can imagine, a lot of different psychiatric conditions or disabilities could impair those things for someone. And generally, in most jurisdictions, when someone's found incompetent to stand trial, they go through what's called a restoration process. So that can look like many different things. At the base of it, it's education. So maybe the person just hasn't been in court before and doesn't understand the role of the attorneys or the judge or the jury or just how a trial works. Or maybe they have intellectual limitations, which make it hard for them to make choices during that. So typically there's education provided by people who are trained in doing so. Sometimes it's because the person has active and acute symptoms of mental illness. So you could imagine if someone is having an acute psychotic episode, they might have other things on their mind which distract them from fully participating in their legal proceedings. And so they receive psychiatric treatment either outside or inside of a hospital to help restore that. There are other criminal competencies that forensic psychiatrists think about. One is to waive your Miranda rights, which we'll talk about later on. There are other functions that someone has to have in a legal proceeding, and they have to be competent to do so. So for example, if someone said, look, I don't want an attorney, I want to represent myself, the courts want to make sure that's a competent decision and it's not informed by active symptoms of a psychiatric condition. You have to also generally be competent to testify in a matter, whether it's testifying about your own offense or someone else's. You have to be competent to plead guilty, and that's been an issue in some high-profile cases where they succeeded on appeal because they've shown that the person was not competent when they took a plea deal. And surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, someone who's facing the death penalty has to be competent to be executed. And we'll talk a bit more about capital cases here in a moment. Another common issue that forensic psychiatrists help criminal courts decide is that of not guilty by reason of insanity. Not every state in the country has this. Kansas, for example, does not have a statute that allows someone to be found not guilty by reason of insanity. But that said, among those who do, which is a majority of the states, it's relatively uncommon. It's something like less than 0.25% of all people accused of crimes or end up found not guilty by reason of insanity. There can be varying definitions. Ohio and most states have some language about having a mental illness, and because of that, you do not have an understanding of the wrongfulness of your actions at the time of the offense. Other states like Kentucky add a second part to that too, where it can be that first part, or because of their mental illness, they were not able to control their behavior. Again, Ohio doesn't have that, but Kentucky does. I practice in both states, so I have to make sure I'm keeping the statute straight. But if someone's found not guilty by reason of insanity, different things can happen. In Ohio, typically what happens is someone is then ordered to receive inpatient treatment at the state hospital in Cincinnati. That's a facility called Summit Behavioral Health Care. Other states don't have the availability of that, or don't kind of default to that. So it's interesting and curious what happens in states like Kentucky when people are found NGRI. Some states offer another option called guilty but mentally ill. That basically results in the person being incarcerated, but sometimes perhaps on a mental health unit, or perhaps they'll get some inpatient extra treatment in a jail facility, but they're incarcerated rather than treated at a hospital. And so it's typically a better strategy for attorneys if both options are legally available, if they meet the statutory criteria for both, it's usually a better idea to go for not guilty by reason of insanity. Part of what forensic psychiatrists do then in association with that is risk assessments to help determine what the least restrictive setting for that person is within their treatment. So someone's found not guilty by reason of insanity for their crime, and they're in a state hospital. There's different levels of security, ranging from this person cannot leave their housing unit, all the way to this person can be conditionally released into the community, where they have some sort of condition where they have to get mental health treatment, or have to live in a group home, or have to take their medications, or avoid alcohol or other drugs. Forensic psychiatrists end up helping with risk assessments to determine the appropriateness for that. So I do that sometimes in consultation, and then my trainees do that at our state hospital at Summit. Sometimes forensic psychiatrists are called for the mitigation phase of a criminal trial. So someone has been convicted, say, of murder. The defense then is allowed to bring up different exculpatory factors to weigh in on the moral culpability of somebody, and help the jury determine what level of punishment and what degree of punishment might be appropriate here. So you can bring up things like psychiatric conditions, addiction issues, family history, trauma history, learning disorders, all sorts of things. There's great leeway within statutes in most jurisdictions for the defense to bring up mental health issues as part of a mitigation strategy. As I mentioned earlier, sometimes we're asked to consult about the competency to ignore a Miranda warning. And typically adolescents are at a very high risk for not understanding this, but also adults with other sorts of disabilities. And there are tools that are sometimes available to guide such evaluations. The language for a Miranda warning varies considerably from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, and the case law as well. But you know, I was struck one time in my training when Dr. Mossman did a case with a 16-year-old where you could look at, for example, his reading fluency, and you know, this young man understood about 20 words a minute of your speech, and the Miranda warnings were read to him, I think, around 180 words per minute, and at a language level that had been shown that he was not able to understand or interpret. So those are the sorts of things that you might consider in doing an evaluation like that. But again, it's very important in making sure people have a fair trial. Sometimes forensic psychiatrists are asked to consult on cases where the person is facing the death penalty. And as a defense attorney, there might be different strategies to try to avoid that with your client. The most common is plea arrangements. My client will plead guilty to a life sentence if you spare his life. There are other ways mental health can come up. The ones I just mentioned: competency to stand trial, not guilty by reason of insanity, GBMI at the mitigation phase. There's another one, though, that's relatively new to Ohio and Kentucky, and I'll mention why I single them out again. But there are statutory exemptions now from the death penalty. And as I mentioned earlier, you have to be competent to be executed. You can be sentenced to death, but be incompetent to be executed. About 3 years ago, maybe 4 years ago at this point, Ohio was the first state in the country to pass a law that gave a statutory exemption to people who had one of four mental illnesses: schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, bipolar disorder, and delusional disorder. And there's a long history about the how and why. There were other ideas as this legislation was going through about what diagnoses should qualify. For example, depression can be just as debilitating as some of these other conditions, post-traumatic stress disorder, traumatic brain injury, and so on. But the Ohio legislature settled on those four diagnoses. So if someone had that diagnosis, and it significantly impairs the person's capacity to exercise rational judgment in one of the following two ways: conforming their conduct to the requirements of the law, or appreciating the nature, consequences, or wrongfulness of the person's conduct. So in Ohio, my understanding is the only capital eligible crime is aggravated murder. So these tend to be aggravated murder cases. And at the time, did they have a mental illness that significantly impaired their capacity to exercise rational judgment? These are very challenging cases, and I've been blessed, I suppose, to have the opportunity to do a handful of them, both in Ohio and Kentucky, which became the second state and the only two states now in the country that have such language in their law. And they're exceedingly challenging. The diagnoses aren't always as clear cut. In Kentucky, they have a wrinkle in their law that the person has to have had a professionally made diagnosis prior to the crime. Ohio gives latitude to make that afterwards, which I think makes sense because oftentimes people don't come to the attention of the mental health care system, or may have been misdiagnosed. And so I think there should be some leeway in considering this. It's challenging, though. Again, as I said before, you have to give an objective, truthful opinion, no matter who hired you or no matter the stakes of it. So there have been some cases where I thought, no, the person did not meet the criteria. Certainly they were not well in a common parlay, but they did not necessarily meet the statutory criteria for that. Another criminal matter that sometimes forensic psychiatrists are suited for is to help with cases of false confession. So here are a couple pictures from the Making a Murderer series from Netflix from, I guess it's probably about 10 years old at this point, but that popularized this notion. But there's a long literature about susceptibility to making false confessions. And so forensic psychiatrists typically do not testify to whether a particular case was a false confession, but they speak to those factors that leave one susceptible to it. And there are different subtypes of it. About a third of false confessions happen among juveniles, and it's helpful for forensic psychiatrists to understand what are some of the interrogation strategies and police strategies that might lead to it. So those strategies, meeting the susceptibilities, can lead to a confession that is not accurate. We'll switch gears now and think about civil matters and non-criminal matters. That C word again, competency, comes up in matters like executing a will, entering a contract, marrying. Technically, you need to be competent to marry someone, to consent to research, to enact advanced directives, all require competency. And you could imagine a psychiatrist being called to help evaluate that for any of these issues. I've never met a colleague that has been asked to do a competency. Was this person competent to get married? But there is a research paper at the Journal Club that Bethany takes part in with our group. We did one year a paper about competency to marry. So hypothetically, there's a blueprint out there on how to assess that. One of the more common civil competencies that forensic psychiatrists might get asked about is guardianship. So in Ohio, they define it as an incompetent person with a capital I here. An incompetent person means a person who is so mentally impaired as a result of mental or physical illness or disability or mental retardation, or as a result of chronic substance abuse that the person is incapable of taking proper care of their self or property, or fails to provide for the person's family or other persons, and so on. What this is a functional assessment. So yes, you want to think about the first part of it. Do they have some disability or substance abuse issue or so on? But can they do these things? Can they manage their money? Can they manage their property? Can they take proper care of themselves? It's really a neat evaluation for a forensic psychiatrist to get called to do, because it's one of the few house calls that we might make in medicine anymore. I often end up meeting people in their homes or where they're at to see whether they can do this. And so I sometimes am asked by either the court or directly by the person who's already under guardianship to provide a new opinion about whether they might be ready to get out. And oftentimes that's the case, that someone's not necessarily permanently incompetent after they've had treatment or made a recovery. Another common thing that forensic psychiatrists are asked to consult on is civil commitment. Every state and jurisdiction is a bit different. In Ohio, if someone has been involuntarily hospitalized for 72 hours, the clinicians then have to work with their patients to make a decision about whether they continue to need involuntary hospitalization, whether the person will voluntarily commit themselves to treatment, or whether they can be discharged. In the cases where the clinician thinks they need ongoing involuntary treatment, they must petition the court for a hearing. And that hearing needs to be held within 10 days of their hospitalization. In some parts of Ohio, the court's default is for the treating psychiatrist or clinician to come in and testify. Hamilton County is relatively unique in that the default is actually for there to be an independent assessment. So a third party, so Dr. Marett, who's not necessarily employed by Christ Hospital, is called to come in by the court to provide an independent opinion about whether this person meets the criteria for commitment to the hospital. The Ohio law allows people to ask for that independent evaluator in all cases, but the default being an independent evaluator is relatively unique in Hamilton County. And it's something that should not be taken lightly, and it really requires that, in my opinion, the thorough independent review to make sure that we're not inadvertently and unnecessarily restricting people's freedoms and liberty. Other types of civil cases, one very common one that I do is to help people assess psychological injuries. And the most common antecedent for this is some sort of accident, whether it's a motor vehicle accident or someone got injured at a job, or they were assaulted, or they were a victim of inappropriate sexual behavior or advances. And people, as you can imagine, develop psychiatric reactions to that. Depression is very common, post-traumatic stress disorder, sometimes traumatic brain injury and cognitive issues. And so I try to help provide an honest and independent opinion about whether someone has developed these. Unfortunately, there are some times where people either exaggerate or just totally what's called malinger having these sorts of issues. And so there are ways to help sort that out, and that's part of the job as well. But again, trying to paint as accurate a picture as possible after reviewing treatment records, administering tests, interviewing the people, and these can be lengthy interviews, interviewing family members, looking at job descriptions and performance reviews, etc. Another common one is disability evaluations, and it's important to think about what sort of disability. So, disability evaluation can be quite different if it's for the Veterans Administration versus Social Security versus private insurance. And these can be really interesting, but also challenging cases as well, where again, you have to really integrate different sources of data and making sure you have the best overall picture you can to whether they meet that criteria or not. Forensic psychiatrists are also asked to evaluate what's called fitness for duty, and this can be before someone's employed. So my colleague across the hall, Dr. Dolan, helps look at different security forces and whether they are fit to be on a security force. Or there could be an incident at work, and how has that impacted somebody, and are they still fit emotionally to do that? Sometimes they have been pulled from work and now they're trying to return to work after they've had a recovery. Um, and here, whereas before with disability or psychological injury, sometimes people fake bad, like I have more problems than I actually do. Here, sometimes do what's called faking well, where you say, I don't have any problems whatsoever, which doesn't make sense. If you've had something horrific happen to you at work, you're going to have some issues from it. But trying to sort that out here can be the challenge. And these are high stakes. You know, if your livelihood is on the line, you could imagine that it's a high stakes sort of evaluation. Some colleagues do this within a niche. So there are people who look at aerospace forensic psychiatry, where they do evaluations for the FAA, and they have their own set of guidelines. So you really need specific training and know-how to know, for example, bipolar disorder may automatically disqualify someone from flying a plane, or needing to know what remission status is needed if someone has a substance use disorder before flying a plane. Sometimes forensic psychiatrists are called to look at testamentary capacity. So, can someone competently write and enact a will? And those can be challenging because sometimes this is done after the person's deceased. So, you may have to look at video recordings or their writings or health records, and really try to extrapolate what were they like at the time that they signed this will. And here's where, again, undue influence, that coercion may come more into play than in some of the other sorts of evaluations you might do. Child psychiatrists sometimes get into this. Child custody issues can be a hotly contested legal matter and pull in forensic psychiatrists. Not too many people around the Cincinnati area do these. They're very litigious, and as you can imagine, the parent that feels like they don't get a good deal or an outcome in it has an axe to grind, and so there can be a lot of issues for the clinicians that do it. So I don't do these, but God bless the people who do. But it's, you know, one of the key principles is that mental illness alone does not and should not be a bar to custody. It's primarily on parenting capacity and thinking about, you know, how is the person addressing any issues that they have. Forensic psychiatrists often get called into malpractice cases. This is one area where you don't necessarily need the extra training. A lot of my colleagues from down the hall here at University of Cincinnati do this without the training because they are clinical experts in an area. But trying to decide whether a clinician or a hospital system deviated from a standard of care, and then did that deviation from the standard of care directly cause some damage. And so you can be helpful to either party or either side of this and trying to provide an honest assessment of that. Forensic psychiatrists often tend to work in correctional facilities as well. Unfortunately, the largest the largest facilities where psychiatric treatment occurs in the United States tend to be in large jails, like Cook County, Los Angeles County, and so on. There's a special subset of laws and regulations that govern what you can do in terms of mental health care within jail and prison settings. So you need to have some awareness and background in that. And there are oftentimes when we get consulted about safety considerations, what can we do to make it as safe as possible for people who are having mental health crises within the confines of a jail or prison system? Forensic psychiatrists sometimes get called to provide some sort of violence risk assessment. Our clinical gut reasoning is not very good, and so it's important to have some awareness of the different tools that are out there. Just briefly, these are the different categories of approaches someone might take. Again, you might say, well, I'm Dr. Marett, and I've seen violent patients for 20 years, and if they wear a blue shirt, that sorts them into a more violent category. That's not how I approach it, but you can imagine someone just relying on clinical judgment. What's better is to use one of these first two boxes, a structured professional judgment tool where, hey, this tool looks at 20 of the most common risk factors for violence, and I'm going to systematically go through the person's records and interview them, interview their treatment team, interview their family members, and think about each one and give each one a rating, and use that to come up with ways not only to categorize their risk, but hopefully mitigate it. These are steps that we need to take to make sure we've done everything we can to give them a shot at not having a violent episode in the future. Another approach is an actuarial tool where it's very rigid. They either yes or no, did they have this or that? Yes or no. What age were they when their first violent episode happened? Things that are quite factual and require no interpretation. And you put that in, and then a computer spits out, okay, in 5 years, they might have a 15% chance of violent recidivism. Courts don't necessarily have a preference for either one, but the forensic psychiatrist needs to use these tools appropriately and then explain them appropriately and explain both the utility and limitations of using these sorts of tools. Some forensic psychiatrists have a niche in doing that with sex offenders. And that can be both to initially sort out their risk, but then to reassess it, to look at the staging or tiering system. And some have interests in providing treatment. Again, what can we do to help mitigate this and help prevent them from offending in the future? Forensic psychiatrists may also develop niche interests among different populations. As I mentioned, sex offenders, but also there are people that only do immigration evaluations. Some people are really interested in stalkers or cults or terrorists. You can imagine extrapolating some of these principles and sorts of evaluations to all sorts of people. One that I have found an interest in is people who have sovereign citizen beliefs. And this can mean a variety of different things, but at the core of it, they hold beliefs that challenge the legitimacy of government and the criminal justice system. And there are lots of different historical underpinnings, most of which are historically inaccurate or incorrect or misinterpreted, but lead them to believe that they're outside of the law and there are ways that they can operate outside of that. You can do a real deep dive in social media, and there's just fascinating videos of how almost brainwashed people become with these sorts of beliefs, but trying to help the court sort out, okay, what is the person's belief system versus perhaps a symptom of a psychiatric condition. And that I see as a real role as forensic psychiatrists when we encounter people who are facing crimes that have these sorts of beliefs. I like forensic psychiatry for a variety of reasons. If you're not fascinated yet, that's fine. But some of the deeper things that I think are at the heart of this are questions that come up about human nature. I think one of the books that was instrumental in guiding me down this path during my psychiatry residency was one in the top right corner here by a forensic psychiatrist, Robert Simon. Bad men do what good men dream. What sorts of things separate the traditional notions of bad versus good, and that gets really blurry and messy, and you see a lot of all sides of humanity when you do this sorts of work. What is the role of punishment? We have debates about this all the time in our journal club, in our program, and um, does the rubber meet the road with that and what we see in the carceral system? Thinking about culpability, you've heard me talk about mitigation and criminal responsibility, and where do we define that for people, and should we? And then thinking about the cultural context of how we come to certain things. How do we come to violent behavior? And thinking about all these things to me is really fascinating. Another thing I like about forensic psychiatry is we tend to be well situated to be advocates. We don't necessarily want to be advocates within an individual case we consult on, but for the broader system. So forensic psychiatrists tend to be leaders in professional organizations like the American Psychiatric Association. They tend to write position papers on, for example, gun violence. They tend to serve on committees in broader organizations like the American Medical Association to help shape these issues. And they tend to work with politicians and leaders to help shape public policy. So briefly, I'll mention if this sparks your interest, how do you become a forensic psychiatrist? You need to complete undergraduate studies and then go to medical school, which is typically 4 years after undergraduate. A psychiatry residency is another 4 years of training to become a psychiatrist that you need to do to apply to these legal matters. And then complete a 1-year Forensic Psychiatry Fellowship, which I'm the director of here at University of Cincinnati. From there, it helps to have mentoring. You never stop learning, and it's always good to push yourself to learn as much as you can and stay current with the literature about different areas. Finally, I'll close with a few thoughts on what I think are some of the top challenges facing the field. I get asked this a lot. What are some of the things that forensic psychiatrists struggle with, and what is the future? And I think the first thing that comes to mind is solving the quote unquote bed crisis among the state hospital system, not just in Ohio, but throughout the country. I don't want to sound like I'm dogging on Ohio. They actually have one of the better systems throughout the country. One of the neat things about training people in forensic psychiatry is they go on to practice all over the country. And so I reconnect every so often with people I've trained with or trained before me. And they all agree that Ohio has a great system relative to other states. But universally, there are long wait lists for people to move from a jail to a state hospital system like Summit Behavioral that I mentioned, or people who just need longer term care. The state hospital system used to be for people who just needed, weeks or months in the hospital, or maybe had more severe symptoms of their condition and really needed that extra care. It's morphed into a system, though, where in Ohio, it's almost 100% of the beds in a state hospital are for people who are incompetent to stand trial, who've been found not guilty by reason of insanity. There's a huge wait list to get in. I think in Hamilton County, there's a 40-person wait list at any given time. And so that leads us to think, how do we solve this? In many states, the lines are so long that it's been a constitutional violation. Ohio's not there yet, but that should not be the bar. So there are a lot of creative things. So for example, in Ohio, there's a push now to provide more treatment services around competency restoration while someone is at the county jail. Or outpatient treatment. Does this person need to be incarcerated or kept in the hospital, or could they go to their doctor's office and get treatment there and get the teaching about the court outside of a hospital or a jail? There are different things that are being done to try to help alleviate that wait list and try to help open up some of the space in the hospital for people who just have very severe illness and need longer term treatment. I think we have to think beyond that as well, though. We can't think of just how do we get the throughput at the state hospital or from the jails and they interconnect. How do we get the throughput going? We have to think, though, about how do we help people not come back? How do we help people live their best lives outside of a criminal system? And we have to think about things along every point of what's called the sequential intercept model. How do we divert people from getting to jail in the first place when they have a mental health crisis? How do we get people into mental health treatment courts instead of being incarcerated? I think we also have to think about unintended consequences. So, for example, in Ohio, I want to say it was about 5 or 6 years ago, there was a bill where people who had lower level misdemeanors could not be committed to the state hospital for restoration treatment, that they would be found incompetent to stand trial, but then sent to one of the local hospitals. I think in theory that's a good thing, but sometimes that was kind of the entry point for people to get into the state hospital treatment. You know, rather than facing like more severe charges or getting to that point, they would be arrested for lower level misdemeanors and get the help that they needed and then move on. And so an unintended consequence is maybe it's just the person's not getting to the treatment that they truly need. With that, again, I think the second challenge facing forensic psychiatry and really society is creating a livable, what I call outpatient world. So what is their life like outside of a hospital setting? Policymakers need to think about this. And I think one of the key components of that is bolstering outpatient community mental health. The local community mental health agencies do the best they can on shoestring budgets, and they really strive to get as much as they can out of it. But the promise of deinstitutionalization has never been met with the actuality of funding and funding the outpatient services as intended. We also need to re-examine housing strategies. I was recently at our professional meeting in Boston a few weeks ago and heard from people who looked at, for example, the housing first model in California, where we thought that was kind of the gold standard, to just get them the housing and then hopefully they'll come around to the mental health treatment or the addiction treatment. That doesn't always work. So it's challenging notions that we long held about what works and what doesn't. And we really needed to examine, it's a very complicated issue. Homelessness is a very complicated issue. I'm not going to solve it here in this talk, obviously, but I think we have to think about what people's lives are like outside of a treatment setting. With that, I really think that comes down to economic strategies. I don't want to get too political, but there are inequities. It's a fact. There are extremely rich people who are living at the expense of everyone else, which exacerbates environmental, nutritional, healthcare issues that are at the forefront of mental health. And with that, economics can mean things in terms of employment. I think there is a certain dignity and purpose when people have meaningful employment. These are all things that I think the system needs to come together, but forensic psychiatrists hopefully can have some role in advocating and help creating the rest of the world. Finally, another challenge that I see quite frequently is that of methamphetamine. I think we have a kind of hidden or maybe increasingly not so hidden pandemic of methamphetamine and stimulant use disorders in our country. And that's an issue because it mimics the psychosis that can be seen in all of those disorders. So for example, the 4 qualifying disorders for the statutory exemption from the death penalty, all to some degree can be mimicked when someone is intoxicated or has used methamphetamine and developed psychosis. And why this is an issue is twofold. There's wide variances in how the law treats substance use versus mental illness. There's not great treatment for it. The best treatment is something called contingency management rather than medication. And often there's a mismatch in what people get funneled into for treatment versus what would actually help. And this can go back to the first issue of the exacerbation of the backup that we see to get into the state hospital system. For example, in Oregon, there was an NPR piece from Oregon about 5 years ago where they interviewed some of the psychiatrists at the state hospital system, and they said, look, about 80 or 90% of the patients we see have chronic long-term addiction issues, methamphetamine issues. And great, like I want people to get the treatment for that, but warehousing them in a system that was actually meant to help people recover from other sorts of mental illness isn't necessarily the best or the most evidence-based treatment for them. So again, very complicated issues. I'm not going to solve them here tonight, but if you were to ask me, what do you see as the challenges and the future directions of forensic psychiatry? I think these are hot issues for forensic psychiatrists at the moment. That said, I'd like to take the remainder of the time to answer any questions you may have.